Welcome to Book Review TV. Now, this week we've had a bit of a problem. Our scheduled author had to cancel, so you're going to have to deal with me today. We're going to talk a little bit about a couple of books that I've written over the last few years. We're going to look at Egypt Unshackled and talk a little bit about that in the context of what's going on in that country today. And we're also going to spend a few minutes talking about the Billionaire Boys Election Freak Show and the 4 books that led to its publication in parts 2 and part 3 of our interview today. So hopefully that hasn't turned you off and you're still going to stay and watch. I want to talk a little bit about Egypt. Now, we've seen a lot in the news about what's going on there. And what I often say to people when they talk about the mess in Egypt right now is, I always say, hey, the United States was also a very hot mess for a very long period of time after it declared its independence from the crown. And the USA declared its independence in 1776, but what most people forget is that it took almost 11 years for the United States Constitution to actually be written, formed, things to settle down. I mean, there was the Federalist Papers, there were internal battles, there were wars, there were commerce issues. There were so many things that happened during those 11 years. And if you consider that Egypt's only had 2.5, they've done pretty well. And what we're going to do is we're going to write a follow-up book on that whole topic of what has happened since February the 11th, when Mubarak fell, all the way through to the forming of a new parliament, to the forming of to having a trial, to the coup that we've seen over the last few days, to the several stops and starts, the Muslimization and the Muslim Brotherhood, and the hard right Islamic turn that parliament was taking, and all of the issues will be in a follow-up to Egypt Unshackled. But first, let's talk about how Egypt Unshackled came into being. Now, the United States media was not doing a very good job of covering the 18 days of the Egyptian Revolution. Indeed, the rest of the world did a pretty horrific job for the first 4 or 5 days. Nobody really took it seriously. We'd just seen Ben Ali in Tunisia fall, and most of the world was pretty shocked by that such a strong man would be gone. That the announcement that there would be a demonstration on the 25th of January was largely met with shrugs by most of us in the media. We looked at that and said, okay, another demonstration in a large Arab country. I'll believe it when I see it. Well, that story should have ended on the 25th of January. They should have just had their one demonstration, and then everything would be over and life would go back to normal. But what happened was that date was deliberately picked because it was a national police holiday, honoring 50 Egyptian policemen who had been killed in a riot by British troops back in 1950. And Hosni Mubarak had turned that into a national holiday, so people were pretty much looking at that date as a good date because most of the police would be away having holidays and celebrating. Well, holiday over, they took over Tahrir Square and had a massive demonstration that aggravated both the secret police as well as the regular police. And for the next 3 days, they overreacted and overplayed their hand in such a way that it began to get the attention of the media. One thing I always tell clients that are very interested in minimizing the damage of a story is never let a story become a second or a third day story. And by chasing down these young demonstrators and beating the crap out of them for 3 straight days, it became a day 3 story. And all of a sudden, the world began to pay attention. So that when we came out on Friday, after Friday prayers of that 4th day of the demonstration itself, the battle for the bridge was the place where fear died. And suddenly, the whole world was watching what was going on. The problem was, if you were watching on U.S. media, you didn't get any idea what was going on. So as a journalist, I sat here and said, well, who's doing the best job of covering this story? And it was very clear that Al Jazeera, The Guardian, several outlets were doing a fabulous job. And I began to take what was happening there as it was happening, live blogging, what was happening on Twitter, everything that I saw. And literally for 18 days, I did not move from this chair. Sitting in front of me were 2 huge screens, and literally everything that was going on was coming through on those. It was being transcribed and sent back out in the form of tweets. Well, people began to pay attention, and I went from about 1,500 followers to well over 8,000, just like that. And I realized that it was becoming a very valuable source of news and information to people out there. Those tweets that were being sent were providing very valuable news and information and sourcing so that people could then go and try to find it. And Al Jazeera was blocked in the United States because of the Cheney and Bush administration. So you could not follow what they were doing, yet theirs was the best reporting out there. So in the U.S., they were exposed to mostly the usual bloviating pundits who didn't know what they were talking about and raising all kinds of conspiracy theories and not a thing based in fact. As we began to look at this, we realized this was a very volatile story, and it was being told by the people there. On the 18th day, when Mubarak finally fell, my wife looked at me and said, well, what are you going to do now? And, as most journalists, I said, I'm just going to move on to the next story, because there always is a story that you can cover. And I really began to look at that, and she said, well, you could actually probably put that into a book, couldn't you? And I looked, and I had over 3,000 tweets of my own that I'd been sending out, and I thought, well, maybe there's something here. But I realized, nobody's going to want to read 3,000 tweets from just one person, and that's kind of crazy. So what she did, she's a chartered accountant, and she loves the forensic digging that goes with that. Back in those days, Google and Twitter were partners, and one could actually look at individual timelines. So I gave her keywords such as Jan 25 and Egypt, and I also gave her the names of several people I had followed as experts on the ground. All that information was very, very valuable. She came up with another 4,000 or 5,000 tweets herself that fit into a very natural timeline. It still wasn't a book, though. As we began to weave and put it together, though, you could begin to see the ebbs and flows. We began to put groups of people together. I looked at the journalists in the square. I looked at the journalists covering in other parts. I looked at the revolutionaries themselves. I looked at the reaction of various governments in the EU, in the United States. I looked at the reaction of celebrities. What were people saying each day of the crisis as it unfolded? And lo and behold, it was a rip-roaring story. It was the Lexington and Concord battles of the Egyptian Revolution. And it is something that I'm very proud of, because it really is something that the students of Egypt can look back to and say, gosh, those 18 days were very, very important. And here's how and why the story was told, and here's how you can follow it day by day. We released the book 3 months to the day after the fall of Hosni Mubarak. So there were some mistakes in it, and we apologize for those and continue to. But we're going to come out with a new version, talking and building from there, because it's such an important historical drama. And when people tell me that Egypt is one hot mess, I say, yes, it is. And look how far it's come in just 2 years. Now, when we return with the program, I'm going to talk a little bit about the election campaign of 2012 and the books that I wrote around that particular incident. I think you'll find it very interesting how that all became the Billionaire Boys Election Freak Show. You're watching Bookview TV. Stay right here.